This is American History TV's Lectures in History podcast. This week, a class on culture and society in the 1920s, taught by Georgetown University professor Michael Kazin. This episode was recorded in 2013.
Now, in my last lecture and in our debate on Monday, which I think went pretty well, you might have been left with a question in your minds. What was the legacy of World War I for American society? Now, the politics of the United States definitely veered to the right during the 1920s. Republican presidents, fairly conservative ones, were elected by landslides in 1920, 1924, and 1928. Congress was under the control of the Republicans throughout the 1920s. With the support of Congress, Republican presidents signed bills which rolled back the income tax increases that were passed during World War I. And the leading social movements on the left, labor unions and the Socialist Party, both lost members during the war. In fact, the Socialist Party was never really a factor in American politics again after the 1920 election. And people on the left generally, whether people we now consider to be liberals, former progressives, or radicals, were all on the defensive during the 1920s. The most popular president in the 1920s, Calvin Coolidge, who took office in 1923 when Warren G. Harding died of a heart attack and then was reelected by a landslide in 1924, famously said in the mid-1920s, "The business of America is business." It was a prosperous time for a lot of Americans, though certainly not all. Stock prices were fairly high. Wages were either stable or going up, depending on what occupation you were in. Farmers are not doing as well as they'd done during World War I, when farm prices are going really high, as they often do during wars. But nevertheless, in many places in the country, they were not doing so badly. Now, there was one piece of legislation passed in 1924, one of actually a number of pieces of legislation on the issue of immigration, which gave a sense both of the power of what you might call the old stock Americans, Americans from mostly Western European backgrounds, white in every case, but also gave a sense, I think, of the vulnerability that those people felt because so many Catholics and Eastern Orthodox and Jewish people had moved into the United States beginning in the 1880s and 1890s. So many African Americans had moved to the north and big cities in the south as well during the war, as you know. This bill was passed in 1924. It's called the Johnson-Reed Act, named after two of the people who were the key senator and key congressman who put their names to the legislation and got it through Congress. What this bill did is it restricted immigration in the United States after that point to 2% of the number of people from any foreign nation who had been in the United States according to the 1890 census. Now, this sounds a little abstract. What it basically means is that the percentage of immigrants allowed to come in the country was dependent on the percentage of immigrants from that country, from that particular country in 1890. Now, 1890 was just at the beginning of the so-called new immigration, just at the beginning of the influx of people from places like Italy, Russia, Poland, Hungary, Greece, Syria, other places in Eastern and Southern Europe. And the 1924 law completely excluded immigrants from East Asia, except for Filipinos, who came from an American colony. So basically, the quotas, and they were called quotas, that were set down for immigration from 1924 on until 1965, this law lasted roughly for a little more than 40 years. It was much easier to come into the country if you were from Ireland, if you're from England, if you're from Norway, for example, because the number of people from those countries in the United States was pretty high in 1890. Much harder if you were from Russia or from Poland or from Finland, let's say. And impossible if you were from Japan or China or Korea. So the United States was supposed to remain an Anglo-Saxon and predominantly Protestant nation forever onward. That was the idea, that was the hope of the people who passed this bill, the Republican majority in Congress, and some Southern Democrats voted for it as well. The only votes against this law really were from people from the ethnic cities, from New York and from Chicago and from Philadelphia, places like that, many of them Catholic and Jewish. But they didn't have enough votes in Congress to stop the bill from being passed, and certainly not enough political clout to stop President Calvin Coolidge from signing it. But as I said, this law was a sign of a certain fear and weakness, I think, among the white Anglo-Saxon majority as well. And the weakness can be glimpsed in what was going on in American culture in the 1920s, which is the main topic of the lecture today. The 20s saw a number of fierce conflicts between supporters of an older, white, mostly Protestant, and very deeply religious and mostly rural order, the majority, but a majority that felt itself in peril. And on the other side, those both immigrant and native born who had a more tolerant or at least a looser sense of personal morality and who lived mostly in modern cosmopolitan cities with a mix of churchgoers and secularists. If you see echoes of this split in our own time, in arguments between those who support gay marriage and those who oppose it, between arguments between those who think sex education in schools is great and those who don't think it is at all, between those who think that the teaching revolution in science classes is just non-debatable, it's part of science, and those who think that creationism or intelligent design should be taught along with the teaching revolution. This is not an accident. Culture clashes, cultural conflicts have a way of lasting a long time. And even when the specific issues that were fought over in the 20s don't necessarily last as long, the legacy of those battles does last a long time. So in many ways, if you're in some parts of the country today, these cultural clashes don't seem quite so much in the past at all. What I want to do today is discuss in specifics 3 sites of this conflict. First, the battles over Prohibition, which of course was the law in the 1920s. Second, clashes over the content of movies, motion pictures, which became in the 1920s the most popular art in America. And then, lastly, the conflict over whether the Darwinian theory of evolution should be taught in public schools, because laws were being passed in certain states in the 1920s to actually forbid the teaching of evolution in public schools. And as we'll see, the rationale for that, in part, was that the parents in many school districts didn't want evolution taught in their kids' schools. And so you got an issue of free speech and the claims of science versus the claims of democracy, if you will. But first, Prohibition, which you've heard something about already, but not since it's been law. Oops. This is a sign. This is a glimpse here of revenue agents busting a still somewhere in one of the cities in the Northeast, together with these mason jars you see here that were about to be filled by this bootleg liquor. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution goes into effect January 1920. It was ratified by enough states in 1919. And by the way, Congress passed it over the veto of President Woodrow Wilson, so you can see how popular it was. Prohibited the sale and manufacture, though not the consumption, of alcohol. And that's interesting, by the way, to note. The 18th Amendment did not stop individuals who actually had liquor in their hands from drinking it. The idea was to stop the business of alcohol, the manufacture of it, the sale of it, the commerce in alcohol, the traffic in alcohol, as it was known. The thought was that if you stop people from being able to manufacture it and distribute it and sell it, eventually people will stop drinking it as well. But Congress didn't want to pillory an individual who might have gotten liquor. In fact, before the amendment was ratified, people would stock up as much liquor as they could if they could afford to, so they'd be able to drink it legally after the amendment was ratified. Contrary to conventional wisdom, Prohibition, even though it did institute a regime of a lot of lawlessness, a lot of people broke the law, especially in big cities, did actually reduce drinking overall in America. places where Prohibition was popular, and there are many of them, drinking did go down. There was a sort of a informal prohibition, if you will. Neighbors would enforce it against other neighbors, for example. So in rural America, in small-town America, in the South, for example, parts of the West, drinking did go down, and quite dramatically. But it went up in big cities. The act that was passed along with the Prohibition Amendment when it was ratified to enforce the act was called the Volstead Act. It was named after a Minnesota congressman who authored it from Granite Falls, Minnesota. And it was, on one hand, a tremendous increase in the power of government. Government, after all, was given the power to go in and bust up any place where liquor was sold anywhere in the country, and also to have border agents across the border to Canada especially, and the Coast Guard was empowered to stop boats from coming in to Florida and other places where to offload liquor. But on the other hand, Congress did not appropriate enough funds to hire enough people to do all that the Volstead Act was supposed to be doing. Only 1,500 agents were hired to actually enforce the Volstead Act, where in a country of over 100 million people was probably not enough. Yet, as I said, it was informally enforced by many Protestant Americans, and they continue to support Prohibition. Not just because they thought it was a good idea for people not to drink, not just because they believed that the liquor business was a sinful enterprise, driving people to do terrible things, but also because they saw it as a symbolic stand against the supposedly hedonistic libertarian values of the modern city, against the alien customs of Catholic and Jewish immigrants, Eastern Orthodox immigrants, many of whom took drinking as just part of their culture. And of course, there are older arguments given as well, which continued to have a lot of salience during the time when Prohibition was law. One of the arguments, heard about before, was that a drunken man was an abusive human being, that he would beat up his wife, that he would neglect his children, that he would be a terrible worker. This is one of the more popular illustrations of this attitude. Also added to it was the anti-immigrant side of it. Here you see two men surreptitiously unloading liquor from Europe, from Russia, going across the border from Canada to the U.S. This was an immigrant invasion, an alien invasion, not of individuals so much, but of immigrant alien commerce. Yes?
With the box on the bottom left, is that supposed to be some sort of Asian liquor due to the stylization of the text, or just another Canadian liquor?
Yeah, to a point. It's from tongs, from China, exactly. Tongs were supposedly gangs of Chinese who terrorized the Chinese immigrant population, also employed Chinese as gangsters. So I'll talk a little bit more about how the fear of gangsters becomes part of this. So you had an urban immigrant split. You had older arguments about protecting women and children. You had a sense of the fear of immigrants being married with the fear of prohibition, and with the fear of prohibition not being enforced the way it should be enforced. You've got a combustible mix here. Now, of course, what made this combustible mix so much apparent to many Americans was the fact that in the bigger cities, in the more cosmopolitan places, among very wealthy people, where there are immigrants and the elite sort of mixing, you had bars, now we think of as speakeasies, which operated almost openly in many of these places, where places like New York and Chicago, where excuse me, where the Prohibition law was pretty much a dead letter. One example of this was a place called the 300 Club in Manhattan, which was run by this woman, Texas Guinan, her name was, who was a former silent movie star. Her club was one of the more famous clubs in America. Everyone who read newspapers in the 1920s would have heard of Texas Guinan's 300 Club. It was famous for being able to sell liquor at very high prices. It was famous for having a troupe of 40 scantily clad fan dancers. And she was a hip, charming, charismatic woman, too. And people wanted to come they wanted to drink at her club. There were many other clubs they could drink at, but Texas Guyanans Club was one of the more popular ones. She was arrested several times for serving alcohol and providing entertainment against city laws. She always claimed, however, and successfully so, that her patrons had brought the liquor in with them. She hadn't sold it to them. And bringing liquor with you, if you'd somehow been able to purchase it yourself, was not illegal. And it was pretty hard to prove that they actually bought it there. There were no receipts. The club was pretty small. It served an elite clientele. That she said, well, the girls really weren't touching the customers on purpose. It was just so small they had to dance close to the customers because otherwise there was no space. She claimed to the end of her life she'd never sold an alcoholic drink in her life. Her club was the hangout for some of the city's wealthy elite and also for many of the most important entertainment celebrities in the country. The great composer George Gershwin used to go there a lot and play his piano there. Impromptu. Some of the guests included some of the biggest film stars who were friends of Guyanan's from her film days. People like Gloria Swanson, Rudolph Valentino, I'll talk about a little later, and Al Jolson. There were wealthy guests with names like Vanderbilt and Chrysler who used to come to the club. And she made a very good living, one way or another, whether legally or illegally. When she died, it turned out she'd earned $700,000 in 1 year, in 1926, and lesser amounts in other years, even though her clubs were routinely raided by the police. Her famous greeting to people who came to the club was, "Hello, suckers." But she was obviously no sucker. Now, this kind of behavior repelled a good many Americans, those who supported Prohibition, and who thought it should be enforced as strictly as possible, and thought people who didn't enforce Prohibition were immoral, evil people. The most popular prohibitionist in the 1920s was not a government official, or certainly not a Treasury Department agent trying to enforce the law. It was the most popular Protestant evangelist in the country, the most popular Protestant evangelist in the United States until Billy Graham. Later in the 1950s. Billy Graham was still alive today, but no longer preaching a lot. The name of this evangelist was Billy Sunday, and that was his real name, by the way. Here's Billy Sunday, a very aggressive, fit guy. Whoops, got ahead of myself there. Billy Sunday was a former Major League Baseball player with the Pittsburgh Pirates. Not very good, but at least he was good enough to play Major League Baseball for a while. He lectured on many different issues. He was a fundamentalist. He believed the Bible was, all the Bible was written by people who understood the will of God, if not by God himself. And so he was also a leading fundamentalist, but his leading cause in the 1920s was Prohibition. And he took direct aim at people like Guinan and her crowd. He called them, quote, the diamond-wearing bunch, the big automobile gang, the silk-gowned. He condemned the low-down, whiskey-soaked, beer-guzzling, bull-necked, foul-mouthed hypocrite who beat his wife and neglected his work. Sunday was a very physical evangelist. He would bound around the stage, he would get down on his knees, he would jump up, he looked like Mick Jagger or something, except he would have hated, of course, Mick Jagger's style of life. But nevertheless, this was a entertaining evangelist. But he was very much in earnest when he talked about Prohibition, or any subject that he lectured on. His most famous talk was what he called the booze sermon. And this is where he urged people, before Prohibition became law and very much after it became law, to get rid of liquor in their lives. He compared liquor to a rattlesnake and a voracious mongoose. He described in very graphic detail what alcohol does to the flesh, to the face, and the liver. And most of all, he challenged men in his audience, and most of his audience was male, to do what he said was their moral duty. You have a chance to show your manhood, he said, by abolishing the curse of your wife and the poor innocent children that climb up on your lap and put their arms around your neck. Tens of thousands heard his sermon and swore an oath to vote for and then enforce Prohibition. With a supporter like Sunday, and there were smaller Sundays all over the country, and a very powerful lobby behind them, too. There was a group called the Anti-Saloon League, which had begun in the 1890s, but really comes into its own in the 1920s, where ministers all over the country, Protestant ministers, mostly from the more evangelical churches, Presbyterians, Baptists, Congregationalists, Methodists especially, are encouraging their parishioners to make sure that they not just don't purchase liquor or drink liquor themselves, but that they put the onus on anybody they know who was breaking the law. So this was a big government program with a lot of people supporting it behind it, and yet at the same time, a lot of people who believed that this was ridiculous, that people could drink without destroying their lives, without beating their wives. And of course, not surprisingly, the rhetoric of the Anti-Saloon League, the rhetoric of Billy Sunday was very much anti-immigrant, sometimes also anti-Catholic. And so Catholics, immigrants in general, took it almost as their duty to disobey the law and certainly to lobby against it. And throughout the 20s, there was a big attempt to actually repeal the Prohibition Amendment, which actually did happen in 1933. But even during this time, Texas Guinan's club was just one sign of the weakness of Prohibition in the big cities. In San Francisco, for example, there were just 9 agents to enforce the Volstead Act, 9 agents in a city of about 300,000 people. The mayor of San Francisco, a man named Sonny Jim Rolfe, actually was seen drinking in speakeasies. This is the Republican mayor of one of the major cities in the country. So you can see what a dead letter the Volstead Act was in the cities. So the law proved difficult to enforce, and the enforcement of it was left more and more to citizens themselves. And a new social movement sprang up, in part to help enforce it, and also to preserve the supremacy of white Protestant native-born citizens, which of course was always one of the aims, if implicitly, of most prohibitionists. And this new social movement was one that took a name of an older social movement, the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan was revived in 1915 by an entrepreneur from the South named William Simmons, who got people to sign up for the Klan and took a proportion of their membership fees. He made a lot of money doing it. And one of the reasons he was able to revive the Klan, using this term, was even though the Klan from the Reconstruction years had been suppressed by the U.S. Army, its memory had lived on in popular culture in the South and elsewhere as well. But as I've mentioned before, it came back in a big way when this film was released in 1915, Birth of a Nation. This is the actual poster of what was, at the time, the most popular film in America 100 years ago, a little less than 100 years ago. On the strength of this heroic portrait of the Klan defending the morality of white women, especially in the South, several million members were signed up by the Klan. But more and more, by the 1920s, journalists, social scientists noticed that the Klan was growing much more in the North than it was in the South. Its headquarters were in Atlanta. Headquarters were in the South, where it had been formed in the late 1860s, early 1870s. But more and more people where there were very few African Americans still were joining the Klan. Places like Indiana and Oregon, rural Michigan, Orange County in Southern California. There, the main impetus for joining the Klan was people who wanted to push back against Catholic immigrants, push back against Jewish immigrants, defend what they saw as an assault on the public schools by parochial schools. Public schools at the time in America, in heavily Protestant areas especially, tended to really be in many ways Protestant schools. The King James Bible, the Protestant Bible, was taught openly in these schools. The history of the world was taught as a story of Protestant supremacy in the world, and Protestants as a more moral group than Catholics, Jews, or other religions. And so the Klan was very much supportive of public schools. Wanted no funding for Catholic schools of any kind, for example. The Klan, by the mid-1920s, at its height, the Second Klan, as it's known, had as many as 5 million members. And it had as many women members as it did male members. Of course, they better tailored uniforms, probably. And again, even though we think of the Klan today as a very reactionary organization, which in terms of civil rights, of course, and ethnic pluralism, it certainly was. Religious pluralism certainly was. But if you think about it as in some ways a continuation of some of the progressive impulses from the early 20th century, just a few years before the 20s, there was some continuity. For example, the Klan generally was in favor of women's suffrage. The Klan generally was in favor, as I said, of public schools and public schools getting more funding. It wasn't necessarily against a cut in income taxes, because it wanted to make sure that the government could have enough money to enforce the Prohibition law. And its key issue was enforcing the Prohibition law. And after all, remember, this was the law. So the Klan, we think of as a lawless, vigilante, violent organization, was violent in many ways, but it was violent in the cause of enforcing the law. And of course, that's how Klansmen and Klanswomen saw it. One pro-Klan magazine in Indiana put it this way: the writing of the 18th Amendment was the crystallization of nationwide Christian sentiment. The enemy liquor gang, angry, vindictive, unpatriotic, is seeking the overthrow of the highest authority in the land. They can count on the hoodlums, the crooks, the vice joints, the whiskey-loving aliens, and the indifferent citizen to help them win. Can they count on you? Here was the larger purpose of the Klan, as stated by Hiram Evans, who was the grand wizard of the Klan through the mid-1920s. And you can see the racial exclusivity of the Klan in this quotation, but you can also, I think, see what you might call a populist edge to the Klan. This is, the Klan grew large. It was enlisting people who were mostly in the working class and lower middle class of white Protestant society. It wasn't getting richer people, and it wasn't getting the poorest white people either. It was getting people who were, as it says, farmers, artisans. People really felt that they had gained something, but not very much in American society, and those gains were under attack by these new groups coming into the country. Native white Protestant supremacy. Traditional moral standards went by the boards, and so forth. This was a restorationist organization, and it was easily the largest social movement in America in the mid-1920s. Well, it didn't have a long life in the limelight. There were scandals. The leader of the Klan in Indiana, where the Klan basically controlled the government for several years, was found raping and in other ways abusing women. Hiram Stevenson. He was thrown into jail as the leader of the Klan in Indiana. The whole Klan was thrown into disrepute by this, and people started to leave it. And also, more and more newspapers, even in states where the Klan was strong, more and more politicians began to denounce the Klan. It seemed to be going too far, especially as Prohibition seemed to be more and more unpopular. The idea of this bully organization, this vigilante organization enforcing the law, which was more and more unpopular, also became unpopular. So the Klan the second Klan continues until World War II, but its numbers decrease. An organization which had 4 million members in the mid-1920s, by 1930 only has about 30,000 members. A third Klan was reorganized in the 1950s to battle the civil rights movement, but that's a later story. Now, the Klan was right about one thing, however. Some hoodlums were making a fine living, defying the Volstead Act. The most famous of them, a name still well known today. If you ever watched the HBO show Boardwalk Empire, anybody watch that show? You see he's one of the stars, or an actor playing him is one of the stars of that show. And this, of course, is Al Capone. This is actually after he was arrested, so he looked better before these days. Al Capone and the gangsters in general, whose main business was to supply illegal alcohol, became important cultural figures in the 1920s. They were hated and feared by a lot of Americans. They were very violent, of course. Gangs they organized, fought with other gangs, organized by other gangsters, and blood ran in the streets of Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, other major cities across the East and the Midwest. But at the same time, people like Capone were also secretly admired by some people, and that's important to realize, I think. You wouldn't have had movies starring people like James Cagney and Humphrey Bogart playing gangsters as rather tough but romantic figures if there wasn't certain admiration that Americans had for them. James Cagney would not have become a great actor and a famous actor, good box office actor, if the gangsters he played were seen as totally reprehensible. Talk about Al Capone as the most famous example of gangsters from the 20s. First of all, to give you some idea why he was admired by many people, at least seen as a symbol. First of all, he was a self-made man. Americans like self-made men, right? We respect them. We admire them. Now self-made women. He rose from obscurity, poverty, to tremendous wealth, tremendous power, and, of course, tremendous fame. Capone was born in an immigrant slum in Brooklyn. He then moved to Italian immigrant parents. He dropped out of school to help his family, went to work, not illegally at first. In the early 20s, he moved to Chicago and rose through the ranks of the mob fairly quickly because of his courage, his intelligence, and his skill, and also his willingness to kill anybody who stood in his way. He organized the rackets in Chicago, and he made them efficient. He was involved not just in alcohol, but also in gambling, in prostitution, and also in extortion for businessmen who didn't follow his orders. Oops. By 1925, when he was only 26 years old, he headed a business that generated $60 million annually, which is equivalent to about $400 or $500 million today. His payroll included no less than 1,000 gunmen who killed at least 250 competitors of his in Chicago, including such colorful characters with great names like Dean O'Banion, Jaime Weiss, and Bugs Moran, Irish and Jewish competitors. And he was a complicated fellow. He was a family man, several children, faithful to his wife, at least that was what most people heard and believed. He hosted annual block parties where he lived in Chicago. He was a consummate consumer. He wore 11-carat diamond rings. He liked to buy and consume rich wine and excellent food, not just excellent Italian food, excellent French food as well. And he was also seemed like a good man who gave back to the community, as we would say now. He was a philanthropist. During the beginning of the Great Depression, when he was still out of jail, 1930, 1931, when Prohibition was still the law, he was making lots of money. He gave millions of dollars to soup kitchens in Chicago. Here are some of the men eating, unemployed men, who were eating on his dime or his quarter. And also he became, obviously, a celebrity. Here's Al Capone with one of his sons, There's I think it's Chicago White Sox, the South Side Chicago baseball team, as some of you probably know, President Obama's favorite team, signing an autograph for Al Capone. My baseball knowledge is not good enough to know who this player is. Anybody know who that player is? I'll have to identify him later on. And this, of course, the fact that Chicago Tribune took a photo of this, and it was on the sports page, right at the top of the sports page in the mid-1920s, shows that Al Capone was, not a good citizen exactly, but nevertheless a celebrated one. And he put Chicago on the map in more ways than one. Now, of course, this couldn't last. In 1929, when Capone was on a trip to Miami, his men executed, and that's the right verb for it, a massacre of 9 men from a rival gang in a garage on St. Valentine's Day, the famous St. Valentine's Day massacre. There's a lot of shootings, sort of drive-by shootings, shootings in private, but this was in a major garage in a major part of Chicago. This was something that the government could not ignore, and it was clear that Capone's men had done it. So public outrage at this forced the federal government finally to act against Capone. They had to find some way of getting him. He was too smart to be found actually violating the Volstead Act. So what they did was they got him on tax evasion. He hadn't really filled out his income tax accurately, because obviously he was hiding a lot of the money he made from alcohol. So he was convicted of tax evasion in 1931 and sent to Alcatraz prison in San Francisco Bay, which was then a new prison, state-of-the-art prison. He contacted syphilis, so he wasn't quite as faithful to his wife as people thought, and he died of syphilis in 1947, still in jail in Alcatraz. Now, another indication of the new urban culture, which many Americans admired, but many other Americans abhorred, appeared on screen. In the 1920s, movies, as I said before, became the most popular form of entertainment in America. Even more popular when you started to have talking films. In 1927, Al Jolson, I mentioned before, as one of the patrons at Texas Guidance 300 Club, was the star of the first full-length talking picture called The Jazz Singer. And Hollywood already, even before you had sound movies, was already a synonym, as it is today, for beautiful, talented people making lots of money, living in thoroughly immoral ways. Charlie Chaplin, the biggest film star of the 1920s, was well known for having a series of teenage mistresses. When he finally got married, he married a woman 40 years younger than him. The second most popular comedian in the 20s on screen was a guy named Fatty Arbuckle, who was accused of raping and killing a young actress at a party he gave at his house. Arbuckle was acquitted in several trials, but his career was ruined by these accusations. As I mentioned before, gangsters were sometimes glorified in films. And one of the things which made those who were unhappy with this new cultural kind of production particularly unhappy was there was a lot of sexual innuendo, almost explicitly, in these films. 1920s films were more sexually explicit than anything you would see until the 1970s, and I'll talk about why that happened. One example of this was one of the most popular film stars of the 20s, a woman named Theda Bara, who herself was actually from Jewish immigrant parents. Her maiden name was Theodosia Goodman. She was from Cincinnati. She was one of what they call the vamps, short for vampire. That is, women who appeared sort of cool, sensual, willing to have sex with men, but as long as they could control those men and ruin them, in fact. She made lots of films, some one-reelers, some feature films, in which the same basic plot rolled out. A good moral man is just brought to destruction because he just can't resist her. They didn't show sex on screen, but it was pretty clear why he was being ruined. But she was never ruined. She continued, as vampires do, to live on and on and on. Another example was this guy, Rudolph Valentino, an Italian boy from Italian immigrant parents, who made many films, but his most popular films were where he played a character known as the Sheik, a supposedly Arab chieftain who lures blonde European and American women to his tent and then seduces them. And they, of course, can't get enough of him, like this woman here, clinging on him, where he's just about ready to push her off for somebody else. These films were very, very popular. Valentino himself was incredible. He was like the Beatles of his day, or like that's a reference that is very old-fashioned today. But hard to think of any film star today who has this kind of appeal. When he died in the late 1920s, very early, prematurely, thousands of women came to his funeral, tried to take pieces of the coffin. Had a very hard time moving through the streets of Los Angeles because it was such a sad day for so many people who loved him. In fact, his popularity was symbolized in many ways by the fact that the most popular brand of prophylactic that was sold in America in the 20s, and after that for several decades, was called the Sheik. I'm not sure those are still made today, but now all this, of course, was tremendously shocking and devastating to a sense of older morality, and not just a Protestant morality either. The Catholic hierarchy in America, which of course was more and more powerful because there were more and more Catholics in America, Irish and Hungarians and Poles, German Catholics, Latin American Catholics. They decided that, figures like this, people like Valentino, who was at least nominally a Catholic, they were being imitated, they were being seen by Catholic boys and girls in the cities, who were making them into heroes, and this couldn't do. So the archbishops, the bishops of America, decided we had to do something about this. So they went to Hollywood and said, look, we're not against movies themselves, they're here to stay, but we'd like you to adopt certain morality, what was called the production code, which would make sure that a couple was never shown in bed together, make sure that this kind of shot would not be shown again on screen, make sure that all you'd see between a man and a woman was a kiss, nothing more, and that as much as possible, gangster films would end with a gangster being killed in a bloody fashion, being discredited, and being very, very clear that he was no model for young people. Production Code in 1930 was actually drafted by a priest and a leading Catholic layman. The production office was called the Hayes Office because it was run by a guy named Will Hayes, who was a leading Catholic layman himself. But it took a while for it to be enforced. It wasn't enforced actually in 1934. So for a while, Warner Brothers, the leading film company, film studio in America at the time, continued to make films with titles like The Naughty Flirt, Misbehaving Ladies, and Hot Heiress. These are not X-rated films. There was no rating yet. These are films you could see in film theaters all over America. But in 1934, the Roman Catholic Church decided to push harder. Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration, liberal in many ways, was not liberal on issues like this, and most Catholics were voting Democratic, so the Catholic Church had more push, more power to influence Franklin Roosevelt's administration than they had Herbert Hoover and Calvin Coolidge's administrations. And so the production code finally was enforced from the 1930s. And from the 1930s until the late 60s, early 70s, when the production code finally was done away with, you did not see a man and a woman in bed together. James Cagney continued to make gangster films through the 30s, but the gangster films showed him basically giving up, either being blown up and crazy, someone who you would not want to follow, or basically telling young people in Angels with Dirty Faces, for example, one of his greatest gangster films, that they should not do what he had done, really giving him a little lesson, in effect. So the films from the 30s to the 60s, a lot of great films, golden age of Hollywood in some ways, but it's in terms of showing sexual content, a much more oppressive age than our age today. And finally, a major battleground in the 20s, as throughout U.S. history, was religion. One can never underestimate the importance, significance of religion in American history. America, of course, was founded in New England, American colonies, by the Puritans. It was founded in the Southwest earlier, partly by Catholic missionaries, Spanish missionaries, going together with conquistadors, armed men who were defending the missions and also looking for gold. And America's always been one of the more church-going countries in the world. And this was just as true in the 20s as it had been earlier. However, there was again a battle over religion in the 20s. On the one hand, organized religion was doing just fine. A majority of Americans, more prosperous, belonged to churches. They could pay pew rents. They could give some money when the collection plate came around. Most churches had ambitious building programs because they could afford to. And most of those churches, the Protestant churches, were ones where the official doctrine held that the Bible was the Word of God. No question about it. But under this surface, where everything seemed fine, everything seemed traditional, everything seemed to be going along as it had been, attendance in the churches was actually down. New churches were often half empty on Sundays, and skepticism about the truth claims of the Bible were growing, more than they ever had before. The 1920s, in other words, was a time of tremendous religious skepticism, tremendous religious conflict, as was true for Prohibition, as was true for film. What are the reasons for this? Well, first of all, Prohibition itself. Prohibition had been, since the beginning of the Prohibition movement in any serious way in the late 19th century, with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, we've talked about before, the Anti-Saloon League. Prohibition was the evangelical Protestant issue. Methodists, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Baptists, the largest Protestant congregations in the country were all very much in favor of Prohibition. Their ministers were ministers who were members of the Anti-Saloon League. WCTU was an evangelical Protestant women's organization, as you know, and it continued to be strong in the 1920s. But Prohibition was more and more unpopular if you were not one of the members of the churches. And as I mentioned before, it was very difficult to enforce where it wasn't popular. That's one reason. Second, women were more independent, and women had been the mainstay of the churches. The 20s was a period in which the period of so-called new woman, women who were able to could go out to work more easily, even if they were married. They would bob their hair, they would wear more alluring clothing, they would go to movies like this one. And so women who had been the mainstay of churches, they might still go to the churches, but they could find other things to do with their time as well. And the churches that were hurt the most by this were the more traditional churches, the more fundamentalist churches. Also, the prosperity of the 20s, consumer prosperity, brought with it other kinds of entertainments, other kinds of associations, other kinds of things you could do with your life besides being a faithful churchgoer. College football became more popular in the 20s than ever been before. Professional baseball had larger and larger crowds in the 20s. People had radios in the houses. They could stay home on Sundays and listen to a sermon if they wanted to. Didn't have to go to church to hear one. There were car clubs. There were movie fan clubs, like the fan clubs that got behind and were so enthusiastic about Willow Valentino. And finally, there was the growing acceptance of Darwinian theory among those with a high school education, which was still a minority of Americans. More and more, there was a sense that Genesis might not be the whole truth. about the way the world was formed. Or at least there might be other ways to understand it. And if Genesis wasn't true, well, maybe the other parts of the Bible might be thrown into a bit of doubt as well. So the 20s is a time when, not surprisingly, you see both the rise of fundamentalism in American churches, a defensiveness on the part of more traditional Protestants especially, and some traditional Catholics, and, on the other hand, a rise in more relativistic, modernistic, science-oriented ways to understand how the world was formed. And science in general becomes more and more legitimate as a source of ultimate truth in the 20s than it had been before. The leading journalist, Walter Lippmann, who was one of the most famous columnists, most widely read columnists in America, wrote in 1929, quote, "This is the first age, I think, in the history of mankind when the circumstances of life have conspired with the intellectual habits of the time to render any fixed and authoritative belief incredible to large masses of men. Any fixed and authoritative belief incredible to large masses of men." In other words, relativism in knowledge is okay. Relativism in knowledge is a fundamental, to use that term, element of what it means to be modern, of what modernism means. That you can have different points of view and still be part of the same society. Citizens can disagree about a lot of basic things, about religion, about race, about politics, without coming to blows. Politics, yes, that was always true before. Race was a fairly new idea, that you could have a multiracial society and everyone could be equal. But religion was very threatening. The idea that maybe the Bible wasn't true, after all. And many Protestants agreed with Lippmann as well. Lippmann himself was a sort of secular Jew. Many Protestants believed that one could accept Darwin and Jesus. One could have two separate spheres, in effect. Science class and church didn't have to contradict one another. But fundamentalists believed this was just one big step towards atheism. And fundamentalists argued also that Darwinism was a brutal philosophy. They said, well, Darwinism is science. We don't know all the details, all the evidence. We're not sure about that. But one thing we do know is that Darwinism equals social Darwinism. Darwinism equals the rule of the fittest, the rule of those already at the top. It's a brutal dog-eat-dog world, and we don't want the children to learn this kind of thing. Some fundamentalists argue that eugenicists, those who wanted to breed a better race of human beings, were evolutionists. And in evolution, if you believe in evolution, you would do things like make sure that people who weren't very bright couldn't have children. You'd force them to get sterilized. They even tried to get some support, ironically, from immigrants who said, well, you really want these high-born elite scientists to tell your kids what to believe about the Bible? Crystallization of this battle between more liberal, more relativistic attitudes towards science, especially towards the Bible, and fundamentalist ideas of what should be cherished and held dear to the hearts of all Americans, occurred during the famous Scopes monkey trial of 1925 in the little town of Dayton, Tennessee, in this courthouse. This is not from 1925. This is a photo I took about 5 years ago when I went down to Dayton. The Scopes trial was called the trial of the century, even though the century was only 25 years old at the time. And in a funny way, it's funny to call it the trial of the century because it lacked any real drama. A law was passed in Tennessee early in 1925 which said that public schools in Tennessee could not teach any class which basically denied that God had created man in his own image. That's what the law said. And it was pretty clear if anybody did that, they were breaking the law. The man who was the defendant in the trial, this guy named John T. Scopes, young science teacher at the public school, Dayton High School in Tennessee, had broken the law unwittingly. He was actually substituting for the regular biology teacher. He wasn't a science teacher at all. He, in fact, was hired primarily to be the football coach at Dayton High School. But he was willing to be the defendant in this trial, partly because he wanted to help his new town of Dayton, Tennessee. He was from Kentucky, actually. He wasn't from Tennessee. The town was in decline economically. It had been a mining town. The mines were played out. And so the town needed something to build up its coffers. Everyone knew after this bill was passed earlier in 1925 that some town in Tennessee was going to be the location for a big test case of the law. So some of the city fathers of Dayton looked around for someone who'd broken the law, in effect, and they found John Scopes, who used to like to hang out at the drugstore in downtown Dayton. And they sort of knew that he had taught biology on several occasions. And he wasn't from the town originally himself, so they thought, well, you know, he won't get in that much trouble. He can leave even if he gets convicted, which they assumed he would be convicted. So the Scopes trial, despite all the drama that surrounded it, despite its importance, I think, in the culture clashes of the 1920s, despite how many people know about it today, was originally, it was located in the town it was located in to save the local economy, which for a short time it did, because lots of people came to Dayton to witness the trial. As I said, the trial didn't have much drama in it, at least at first. Both sides in the trial, both the prosecution and the defense, basically agreed that the defendant was guilty as charged. And Scopes didn't really suffer at all from being convicted, which he was. In fact, he basked in the renown of the case for the rest of his life. When he went to, places where evolution was popular, he would get drinks bought, dinner bought. He became a petroleum engineer and got jobs all around the world. He had a pretty good life. But the trial, nevertheless, was a dramatic one. It drew over 100 reporters. It was one of the first trials to be broadcast on a national radio hookup. And it became a touchstone for a debate that continues to rage today in America. The two principal lawyers in the trial were two very famous men. Clarence Darrow, one of the most famous lawyers in America, a radical who defended various left-wing figures like Eugene Debs of the Socialist Party and others on the left, and William Jennings Bryan, who, as you know, ran for president 3 different times for the Democratic Party and was still seen as a progressive Democrat and a hero to many rural, small-town Protestant Americans. Bryan stated the stakes of the trial this way. He said, at the end of the trial, which took 8 days, here has been fought out a little case of little consequence as a case. But the world is interested because it raises an issue. And that issue will someday be settled right, whether it is settled on our side or on the other side. And here was the issue. It wasn't just whether one could reconcile the Bible with the writings of Darwin. The law also raised the question of democracy, whether a teacher in a public school was free to teach the truth as he saw it or she saw it, or whether, quote, the people have the right to control the educational system which they have created and which they tax themselves to support, which was Bryan's understanding of it. He said, if you want to teach evolution in New York City, that's fine with me, but don't teach it in Tennessee, because the majority of people in Tennessee don't want it taught here. And he was definitely right about that. The legislature had passed the bill overwhelmingly earlier in the year. Clarence Darrow, the guy on the left, the great radical lawyer, agreed to head the defense for Scopes only after he learned that Bryan was going to be on the prosecution team on the other side. Darrow had once been a fan of Bryan. In fact, he campaigned for him in 1896 and ran a congressional campaign in 1896 as a Bryan Democrat, unsuccessfully. But now, 30 years later, Darrow reviled Bryan as a foe of intellectual liberty, as a symbol of what he said was despair and bigotry. Financing the defense, paying Darrow's salary and that of other defending lawyers, was the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, which they saw as a defense of free speech. They said, we don't care about science against Christianity. We just believe that teachers in public schools should be able to teach what they believe is the truth about science. And Darrow, even though he was agnostic and some would call an atheist. He didn't want to attack religion. That was not his aim. What he wanted to do was basically say that the question of religion was not the primary question here. The question was whether people can teach science as it's understood. He said, I know there are millions of people in the world who look on the Bible as a divine book. I have not the slightest objection to it, Darrow said. But it is not a book of science. Never was never meant to be. So in using the Bible to stop the teaching of biology, the legislature, according to Darrow, had violated the First Amendment. Well, the first 6 days of the trial were taken up with long testimony from scientists who were describing the theory of evolution to people in the courtroom and people around the country who probably didn't know much about it. The judge, who was a Bryan Democrat, listened to it. He clearly was unhappy with the testimony. He wasn't sure it was germane to the case, which was, after all, not about whether science was right or not, but whether or not the law had been broken by this particular science teacher. The 6 days were, long. Darrow thought he was doing well. Bryan had little to say during the 6 days. There were other prosecution lawyers who questioned the scientists. At the end of the 6 days of testimony, the judge ruled none of this testimony was germane. It was part of the trial transcript. You can read it today online if you want to. But it wasn't germane to the case. So he told the jury, disregard all you've heard in these previous 6 days. This left both of the principal lawyers frustrated. Darrow was understandably frustrated. He wanted to show the scientific reason was superior to what he saw as religious superstition. Bryan was also frustrated. He hadn't joined the prosecution to preserve a single law in a single state. He wanted to talk about the Word of God. He wanted to defend the Bible. And there was no way he could do that within the parameters of the trial, at least as they had been set by the judge. So then what was became the most famous part of the trial took place on the seventh day of the trial. There was a lot of people crowding in the courtroom. As you see, the courtroom was, fairly big, but nevertheless, only fit about 300, 400 people there. And many more people, reporters, regular citizens, people from outside the area wanted to see this famous trial, which was being reported in newspapers all over the country. So the judge decided he would move the proceedings outdoors. And one of the reasons, too, it was July in Tennessee. It's East Tennessee, it's mountainous Tennessee. It's not as hot as, say, Memphis in July, but it's still pretty hot. Middle of July without air conditioning. People have these fans given to them by a local funeral parlor, which they were waving up and down as quickly as they could in front of their faces. But you can see in this photo, Bryan has one of those down by Darrow's elbow. But nevertheless, it was hot. So, afraid that the floor of the courtroom would collapse, afraid that people were, bound together and almost suffocating because it was so hot, the judge on the seventh day moved the proceedings outside to where there was a speaker's platform and wooden seats that had been set up by the local authorities. Here's a photo. Soon after the court reconvened in the open air, one of the defense attorneys shocked and delighted the throng of 3,000 people watching with a single sentence. He said, "The defense desires to call Mr. Bryan as a witness." Now, it's pretty unusual to ask a prosecutor to take the stand to defend, in effect, his point of view. But Bryan, who was as you know, a famous speaker, he had used his speaking talent to become three-time nominee of one of the two major political parties in America, accepted the challenge. He said, fine, I'll accept being examined by the defense if, after that's finished, you allow me to cross-examine them as well. And not just Darrow, but everybody on the defense, all the key defense attorneys. There were three altogether. Now, the trial could finally become the contest of faith for which Bryan had hoped and the press had expected. And Darrow, as the most experienced, most famous trial attorney on the defense team, was going to conduct the cross-examination. And here's a photo. You see Darrow in the center there, and on the left, Brian sitting in a chair, ready to be cross-examined. The court stenographer is to the left of Darrow, sitting down in the shirt sleeves. And this is how the cross-examination began. You have given considerable thought to the Bible, haven't you, Mr. Bryan? Said Darrow. Yes, sir, I have tried to, said Bryan. For the next 2 hours, Darrow kept his foe on edge with a cascade of short questions about the trustworthiness of Scripture. Do you believe a whale swallowed Jonah? Do you believe Joshua made the sun stand still? Do you take the story of the flood to be a literal interpretation? Do you think the earth was made in 6 days? Bryan was trying to kind of cagey. He didn't say yes to any of Darrow's questions, at least not an unqualified yes. The whale, he said, maybe it was just a large fish. Maybe it wasn't actually a whale. And maybe God had not specifically directed that large fish to ingest a man. Neither did Bryan speculate about how long the Lord had suspended the laws of physics to stop the rotation of the earth. Because clearly, if you make the sun stand still, then the earth has some problems in its rotation as well. And Bryan rejected the notion that the day of creation mentioned in Genesis was actually 24 hours. Bryan subscribed to what some fundamentalists called at the time the age-day theory, where the days mentioned in Genesis actually refer to an eon of time, thousands and thousands of years for each day. And Bryan evaded direct questions with answers that seemed rather thoughtless and dogmatic. For example, when Darrow asked when the flood took place, Darrow said, quote, he'd never made a calculation. Darrow pressed on. What do you think? Bryan bristled. I don't think about things I don't think about. That sort of left the door wide open to ridicule. Darrow, do you think about things you do think about? Answer, well, sometimes. The court reporter noted laughter in the courtyard. After several minutes of this, the prosecutors frantically asked the judge to stop the cross-examination. Darrow, he claimed, was straying too far from the origin of the case. Clearly, his fellow prosecutors needed to stop Bryan from hurting himself and hurting the cause of fundamentalism. The judge reminded the prosecutor, who tried to stop the case, that Bryan wants to ask the other gentleman questions along the same line. And Bryan wanted to continue. But clearly, on the 7th day of the trial, he should have rested. The day ended with a merciless exchange between the two lawyers. Bryan shouted to Darrow, your only purpose is to slur at the Bible. Darrow snapped back, I'm exempting you on your fool ideas no intelligent Christian on earth believes. They go to sleep, they leave, they go to sleep. The next morning, the judge comes in and orders Bryan's testimony expunged from the official record. He says it wasn't germane to the trial. So the actual transcript is very long. The official record's not very long. Then Darrow made sure the last meaningful words in the trial would be his. He made sure that Bryan would not be able to cross-examine the other lawyers. First order of business after the judge ordered Bryan's testimony taken out of the court record, Darrow asked the judge to instruct the jury to bring in a guilty verdict. He says, we're pleading guilty. The jury goes out for a few minutes. They come back, say, yes, John Scopes is guilty, has to pay a $100 fine. That was the only penalty. Later on, this cross-examination becomes famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, in a very popular film in 1960 called Inherit the Wind. Have you ever seen this film? And the two figures were played by Spencer Tracy as Darrow and Frederick Marx on the other hand. And the film made no doubt which side you should agree with, of course. Spencer Tracy never plays the villain, if you know your old Spencer Tracy films. Now, Bryan side had won a hollow victory, but it was men like this, H.L. Mencken, a popular, satirical genius, reporter for the Baltimore Evening Sun, which was then a leading newspaper in America, who actually paid the $100 fine that Scopes owed. Scopes didn't pay it. The Baltimore Evening Sun, in the person of his star reporter, H.L. Mencken, paid that fine. And H.L. Mencken and other modernists in the cities who ran the major newspapers in the country made sure that for most Americans, even though legally the Scopes trial was a victory for the prosecution, made sure that it was not a victory in the culture wars of the 20s. A few other states passed anti-evolution laws. Most Americans continue to believe in the biblical account of creation. In fact, according to polls, most Americans still do. But they increasingly rejected the idea that religious truths were more legitimate and should overshadow scientific ones. Biology classes in most of the country are not censored. And fundamentalists, after the Scopes trial, retreated for the most part from the public arena and focused on building an institutional base of their own. Fundamentalist colleges, fundamentalist seminaries, fundamentalist magazines, and fundamentalist radio stations. And Mencken's view about Bryan convinced many Americans that, in fact, anybody who would support banning the teaching of evolution in public schools, who is opposed to scientific truths, is an idiot, as Bryan was an idiot. Here's a little bit of Mencken's obituary of Bryan, who died 5 days after the end of the Scopes trial of diabetic shock. This is Bryan's obituary of William Jennings Bryan, not the kind of obituary anybody really wants. Quote, "He seemed like only a poor clod like those around him, deluded by a childish theology, full of almost pathological hatred of all learning, all human dignity, all beauty, all fine and noble things. Bryan was a peasant come home to the barnyard. He looked like a dog in rabies in the Dayton courtyard, with rabies. Finally, Bryan liked people who sweated freely and were not debauched by the refinements of the toilet." This is an obituary of one of the most popular politicians in America in his time. So this aspect of the culture wars was already being won by the modernists, clearly, as were most of the others. Film and, of course, Prohibition itself was repealed in 1933. But the traditionalists didn't go down easily. They continued to pass some anti-evolution laws. They continued to think Prohibition was a good idea. And they continued to nurture a sense that restoring America's traditional values is a good thing. And if you get away from those traditional values, you get away from what made America great. And if you hear echoes of that in political debate, last year in the presidential campaign, and even today, it shouldn't be a surprise. I want to end with a little piece of popular entertainment by one of those fundamentalists, a very gifted musician named Uncle Dave Macon from the 1920s, a song called "The Bible's True." You hear okay?
Genesis to Revelation on a bright day. Evolution teaches man came from a monkey. I don't read no such a thing in the day of the week of Sunday. But the Bible's true, oh, you're not believe it. I've seen enough that I can prove it. What to say, found to be that way, Lord again. God made the world and everything that he did. He made man perfect and a monkey wasn't he did. What to say, found to be that way, Lord, yeah. From the evolution, there's the world, the world to see. There's no man from anywhere born make a monkey out of me. But the Bible's true, you're not believe. I've seen enough and I can prove it. What you say, found to be that way, ain't that right? God made the world and everything that it the big man perfect that the monkey wasn't dead. What you say, bound to be that way, you know I'm right. God made the world and He made man. Woman for His half made beast that if you can. Well, the Bible too, yes I believe. I've seen it up and I can. What you say, bound to be that way. Now you know it's so. Well, God made the world out of everything that He did. The big man perfect that
Get the ideas.
What you say, bound to be that way, Lord, yeah.
Monkey wasn't in it. Have a great vacation.
Thanks for listening. Please rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.